I want to spend a couple videos talking about Longfellow's sonnets. And to tell the story of Longfellow's sonnets, it's going to take a little while, but I'm a Longfellow scholar and I love Longfellow. And so I want to do a deep dive for those who are interested. If Longfellow is not your jam, find another video on our channel. But if Longfellow is your jam, and if you want to know more about sonnets, stick around. So Longfellow's first collection, Voices of the Night, in 1839, doesn't actually have any sonnets in it. It's not until his collection, The Belfry of Bruges, which is published in 1845, that we actually have the first real sonnets. And there are only a couple of sonnets in this collection, but they give us a taste of what's to come. Now, Richard Wilbur in the 20th century will call Henry Wadsworth Longfellow the greatest of the American sonneteers of the 19th century. I don't know if I agree with that. There are a lot of good sonneteers. We've talked about people like Frederick Goddard Tuckerman and others. But there's something very unique about Longfellow's sonnets. And like all of Longfellow's poems, they really connected with his audience and became favorites. So I want to talk a little bit about these early sonnets of Longfellow that we start getting in the mid-1840s. Now, there are three main sonnets in this collection, The Belfry of Bruges and Other Poems. And Longfellow liked to kind of have a main collection, then he would have kind of like subsections of the collection that he would give particular titles. This is something that you find throughout American poetry. Dana Gioia has a whole meditation on how Longfellow kind of invents the American conception and maybe even the modern conception of the poetry collection itself. We could talk about that later. But one of the cool things that he does is he kind of groups all the poems that have a like form together. And at the end of The Belfry of Bruges and Other Poems, we have a sonnet section. There are three sonnets: The Evening Star, Autumn, and Dante. And I want to read you The Evening Star. Low in the painted oriel of the west, whose pane the sunken sun incarnadines, like a fair lady at her casement shines, the evening star, the star of love and rest. And then anon she doth herself divest of all her radiant garments, and reclines behind the somber screen of yonder pines, with slumber and soft dreams of love oppressed. O my beloved, my sweet Hesperus, my morning and my evening star of love, my best and gentlest lady, even thus, as that fair planet in the sky above, dost thou retire unto thy rest at night, and from thy darkened window fades the light. Longfellow's brother, who would serve as his biographer, would later call this poem the only love sonnet Longfellow ever wrote. I think even says the only love poem Longfellow ever wrote. Longfellow has lots of romance in his poetry, romance, love between men and women, but he seldom is expressing it from himself as the speaker to a human woman, a human beloved. But in this one, he does. And Longfellow, I think we can see this carrying on the English Romantic tradition, having an octave that gives us an image from nature. And this image is the evening star. The evening star is like a fair lady who shines in the evening, and then puts off her radiant garments and goes behind the somber screen. The evening star, I was just looking at the evening star rising and setting. The evening star is Venus. Often the evening star will be the first star you see, and you'll see it not too far above the horizon, at least this time of year in the spring, in the evening, and then it sets pretty soon. And so he's using this image of, the evening star sets soon, but it's very glorious before it sets. And then in the sestet of the sonnet, he says, "Oh, my beloved, you're like this, my best and gentlest lady, even thus as that fair planet in the sky above, dost thou retire unto thy rest at night, and from thy darkened window fades the light." It's kind of this lovely, the fading of light is not a death or something. It's a rest. And this 1845 collection also has another poem, not a sonnet, called The Day is Done, which is one of the great American poems of kind of setting things to rest at evening and turning to poetry to soothe yourself. So that's The Evening Star. And, structurally, it's a little Shakespearean, right? We have that rhyming couplet at the end, night and light. West incarnadine shines, rest, divest, it reclines, pines, oppressed, Hesperus, love, thus, above. It's interesting. It starts out in a Petrarchan manner. Also, you have this incarnadines or incarnadines, I think is how you'd have to pronounce it to have it rhyme with shines. Incarnadines, it's a 4-syllable word that rhymes on the last syllable with shines. He's showing off here. You also have this wonderfully kind of soundy line, behind the somber screen of yonder pines. Behind and pines at the beginning and end of the line have that nice ein sound, and then in the middle you have somber yonder. So Longfellow loves creating these chiastic patterns of sound where you have the outermost words share a sound, and then an inner structure of words that also share the same sound, and you have this sort of central point, which has the unique sound in the line. Longfellow is so good at this. If you're a poet and you're like, how do I make my lines more interesting? Think about these chiastic structures of sonic repetition and sandwiching. It's very, very cool. I don't want to talk, though, all about the Evening Star. I want to talk about the Dante sonnet. Dante, this is a sonnet that, if you read it in 1845, you would have thought, Longfellow does like Dante. I remember back in 1839, he translated, a couple short passages of Dante's Divine Comedy at the end of his Voices of the Night. So you might have thought, okay, Dante's still on his mind. You wouldn't know, of course, yet that Dante's greatest sonnets will arguably be sonnets about Dante that will be written much later in his life, and that Dante will become in the 1860s the first American translator of the whole Divine Comedy. You wouldn't know that in 1845, but it's really cool reading this Dante sonnet in 1845 and knowing that's coming. It's very cool. It kind of sets up some things. So let's look at this poem. Tuscan that wanderest through the realms of gloom with thoughtful pace and sad majestic eyes, stern thoughts and awful from thy soul arise like Farinata from his fiery tomb. Thy sacred song is like the trump of doom. Yet in thy heart what human sympathies, what soft compassion glows, as in the skies the tender stars their clouded lamps relume. Methinks I see thee stand, with pallid cheeks by Fra Hilario in his diocese, as up the convent walls in golden streaks the ascending sunbeams mark the day's decrease, and as he asks what there the stranger seeks, thy voice along the cloister whispers, peace. The rhyme is so good here. This is a much more strictly Petrarchan sonnet. We have gloom, eyes, arise, tomb, doom, sympathize or sympathies, skies, relume, cheeks, diocese, streaks, decrease, seeks, peace. So we have ABBA, C, D, C, D, C, D. It's a nice tight rhyme scheme there, where you don't even have an E rhyme. I often like to think that this really, really tightens and focuses the sestet and makes the sestet really feel like a series of 6 instead of sort of a series of 4 and 2 like it does back in the Evening Star, where you have night and light, which are their own new couplet and rhyme word that don't rhyme with the above, thus, love, Russ. Thinking about the structure of what you want to say and how you want to set a scene or move from thought to thought, that's going to dictate how you choose the rhyme scheme of your sonnet. And Longfellow knows perfectly how to choose this. In the octave, we get this kind of general picture of the wandering, morose Dante. Dante, if you know anything about his life story, was exiled for most of the later part of his life, and that's when he wrote the Divine Comedy. So, you have this very famous, exiled poet working on his masterpiece, even as he longs for his city and his family back in Florence. So we have Tuscan that wandereth through the realms of gloom with thoughtful pace and sad majestic eyes. What are the realms of gloom? Well, literally, they're his exile, wandering away from his home of Florence. But the realms of gloom, of course, also is the Inferno, the Tuscan who wanders through the Inferno. That is the real realm of gloom. So exile and the Inferno are kind of these two levels of meaning here. Stern thoughts and awful from thy soul arise, like Farinata from his fiery tomb. Farinata, he's one of the, I think, heretics in the Inferno, who he's burning alive in a tomb for, his heresy, and he sits up, his soul sits up and has a conversation with Dante in the Inferno. Thy sacred song is like the trump of doom, yet in thy heart what human sympathies, what soft compassion glows. So we have this kind of this kind of doom, awful, stern element to Dante's poetry, but also these feelings that Longfellow himself prized much more than doom and awe. Soft compassion, tender stars. Longfellow, especially in his 1845 collection, he's really longing for this sort of soothing rest and tenderness, and get away from the violence. He has a poem in the Belfry of Bruges about that the reign of violence is over, he says. It's called The Occultation of Orion. He also has the Arsenal at Springfield poem in the same collection, which is saying, why do we make all these weapons for war when brotherly feeling and tender compassion should reign. So this Dante poem, it is meditating on Dante, but it's also picking up on a lot of the themes that he's thinking about in the mid-40s. We should do a whole sort of themes of Dante or themes of Longfellow throughout his life. It's almost like you could spend your whole life studying what's going on in Longfellow's poetry. Let's talk about the sestet here. Methinks I see thee stand with pallid cheeks by Fra Hilario in his diocese, as up the convent walls in golden streaks the ascending sunbeams mark the day's decrease. So we go from this sort of big hey, this is the kind of guy you are, this is the kind of things that are going on in your poetry, to this particular scene. He's with Fra Hilario, who was a real person who I think Hilario writes, or someone else writes, about Dante visiting the convent that Fra Hilario oversees. And it's this kind of encounter with this clergyman and this great poet, and this sort of moment of what's he up to? What's he doing? We have this great mini conversation that just really sums up things. As he asks, Fra Hilario asks, what here the stranger seeks? The stranger is Dante. Thy voice, and it's not the you, Dante, because we're addressing him from the beginning. Tuscan, this is sort of a nominative of direct address we have here. A Tuscan, thy voice along the cloister whispers peace. So with a snapshot of Dante standing there. The friar says, what are you doing here? What are you looking for? Peace is all he says. Longfellow would write many more poems about Dante, but they would take place much later in his life. The last of the sonnets that I like to categorize as early sonnets actually comes about in the early 1850s with this collection, The Seaside and the Fireside, which Longfellow publishes. And just like in Belfry of Bruges and other poems, he has kind of these subsections. In The Seaside and the Fireside, he has a section called By the Seaside and then By the Fireside. So we have, these ship and maritime and kind of nautical themes, and then these very homey grounded themes in the By the Fireside. So it's interesting, Longfellow chooses to write another sonnet about a famous poet. And this is about Shakespeare, but it's not just about Shakespeare. You'll see. Sonnet on Mrs. Kemble's readings from Shakespeare. Oh, precious evenings, all too swiftly sped, leaving us heirs to amplest heritages of all the best thoughts of the grievous sages, and giving tongues unto the silent dead. How our hearts glowed and trembled as she read, interpreting by tones the wondrous pages of the great poet who foreruns the ages, anticipating all that shall be said. O happy reader, having for thy text the magic book, whose sibylline leaves have caught the rarest essence of all human thought. O happy poet, by no critic vexed, how must thy listening spirit now rejoice, to be interpreted by such a voice. It's a little more straightforward and a little less kind of gloomy and profound. But Mrs. Kemble was a woman who was kind of a good example of the odd entertainment that people had in the 1850s. She would go around giving readings from Shakespeare, and people would pay. It wasn't quite, I'm paying to see a whole production of a Shakespeare play, but I'm paying to have a really great reader and performer, read out his famous sonnets or speeches. And so this is what Mrs. Kemble would do. And Longfellow actually writes in his journals about seeing her read. And so we have this octave sestet structure that in the octave we have, "Oh, precious evenings," how our hearts glowed, sort of the experience of the listener. And then in the sestet, he has the first three lines of the sestet are, "Oh, happy reader." So the reader is Mrs. Kemble. You have for your text the magic book whose Sibylline leaves. The Sibylline oracle was the Greek oracle who gave these divine prophecies in poetry. She was Apollo's Sibyl, and so Apollo is this patron god of poetry. So Shakespeare has become this Sibylline thing. He is our Apollo, and she is his interpreter. But then we have a turn to Shakespeare himself, this address to him, like we had an address to Dante back a few years before this. "Oh, happy poet, by no critic vexed." I love this. There's something about Shakespeare that certainly Longfellow thinks, who could object to Shakespeare? We could look back and see, I think Byron famously said, Pope's a better writer than Shakespeare. But at least in Longfellow's opinion, "Oh, happy poet, by no critic vexed. How must thy listening spirit now rejoice to be interpreted by such a voice?" So even though he's talking to Shakespeare, this is really another praise of Mrs. Kemble. Like, wow, Shakespeare must be like so happy that you're reading this. So this is almost like a little taste of, the social scene in the early 1850s when Longfellow is writing. Longfellow wouldn't write many more sonnets until the 1860s, about 10 or more years after the sonnet on Mrs. Kemble's reading from Shakespeare. But when he returned to sonnets, he would return with Dante still on his mind and produce some of the most important sonnets ever written, certainly in the 19th century in America, and I would argue ever. We'll look at those next time. There's a bonus feature, though, to Longfellow's early sonnets of the 1840s and 50s, because Longfellow wrote a secret sonnet that he didn't publish in the 40s and 50s, but he actually wrote it a couple of years before The Belfry of Bruges came out. But in order to know about that secret sonnet, we need a whole nother video.